So welcome to the Data Versioning Working Group session at the Research Data Alliance Plenary 16, virtually in Costa Rica, but actually wherever you are, welcome to this session. And before we dive into the session, CSIRO, ARDC, and ANU also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, sea, and waters of the area that we live and work on across Australia. We acknowledge their continuing connection to their culture, and we pay our respects to their elders, past and present. So there's a document, maybe Ming or Leslie can share the link again, where we take our notes for the session, and please also add your name to the list of attendees so that if we have something to share, we can share that with you via email. And for comments and questions, please put them into the chat, and we will monitor the chat and come back to your questions, and in this way get the order of speakers. So our agenda for whatever your time is now is we will give you an update on the status of the working group, and if you haven't attended any of the earlier meetings, give you a very brief introduction of its history. We will review the versioning final report, and then we've had some community feedback on the final report. So we would like to discuss with you developing a plan to promote adoption of data versioning principles, which could be through working with other RDA groups. And the other item was develop actionable recommendations for the data versioning principles. Then we would like to discuss the application of the data versioning principles to a question that came up at the last plenary, or leading up to the last plenary, about attribution, authority, and ethics of data republication and sharing. We would like to hear from you what other topics you think we should be working on. And then since we are transitioning to an interest group, we will briefly have a look at, then having discussed all these points, what the interest group should look like. And we are looking for co-chairs. So, but we will also send out a call for co-chairs over the mailing list. So this group has a history, and it started at the plenary 8 in Denver in 2016 with the Birds of Feather meeting as a reaction to the data, to the recommendations of the dynamic data citation working group, where versioning was one of their recommendations, but nobody knew what that meant. So we went on to constitute a data versioning interest group, had a meeting of that, where we decided that actually we could produce something in the context of a working group. The difference between interest group and working group is that a working group is tasked to produce an outcome over a relatively short time period of 12 to 18 months, while an interest group can carry on working and discussing topics of whatever they set out in their charter as their topics. So we first had this progression from Birds of a Feather to interest group to working group. The working group produced report and recommendations, and then submitted them to the technical advisory board for adoption. Then in March this year, We reported on the adoption of what we call the data versioning principles by the Technical Advisory Board. They published supporting materials and started discussing the future of the working group. And one of the outcomes of that discussion was that we want to continue working as an interest group. So this is why we're here, to transition the group to an interest group to promote adoption and work on emerging topics in data versioning. So the objectives of this meeting are to determine how to go forward and what the activities should be, and new topics that we want to include. As I mentioned, we did publish something. We published the final report, which went through community review. It has a DOI, and it has been well read. So when I checked the day before yesterday, we had 5,362 reads, which is pretty good. We received 2 comments in writing. That feedback was incorporated into and all the feedback was incorporated into a revised version of this report, and we wrote a paper that we submitted to Data Science Journal, which has gone through review, and we are in the process of addressing those points with some additional reviewer input. And then accompanying this document is our collection of use cases that we draw on, and this might be something that we also might maybe extend as part of our work in an interest group. So one of the feedbacks that we got was in our final report, we didn't call what we set out as recommendations because we didn't set them out in normative language. And it has been fed back to us that it would be good and useful and needed by the community if we could formulate our principles not just as ideas, but as recommendations in a normative language. And that will require some work, and test those recommendations against the use cases that we collected and maybe additional use cases. And then, of course, with all works coming out of working groups, there's the expectation that the outcomes are promoted and adoption monitored. So how would we want to do that, and which RDA groups and other groups outside of RDA should we work together? Leslie, can I hand this over to you?
On the proviso that you move the slides forward.
Yes.
So apart from the issues that Jens raised that came out of the report we wrote, we had another interesting thing start at the beginning of this year. And I can't remember which mail list it was on, but it got very lively and almost went viral, where someone was reporting a case of data republication from a domain repository into a general repository, where the domain repository kind of felt that they weren't really getting credit for what had happened. And so a flurry of questions came: is this legal? Is it ethical? How does the user know which is the authoritative copy? Now that journals insist that you cite your data, who do I cite? And then depending who I cite, who gets the credit for the data? But more importantly, does the originator and the funder of the data get recognition? And so RDA agreed to let us have a late breaking BOF. I think it was probably the first one they'd had. And I've got a link there. And again, it's in the notes, which you've all got a copy to. So you can see who attended, the presentations that were made, and the comments in the chat. And then we just ran it, Jens, Ming and I ran it a couple of weeks ago on the same theme, trying to get a feel for how big this issue was, how much people appreciated it. But I think you can understand why it ended up in the data versioning group. Next. So the reality is that research data in digital form can easily be copied, stored in multiple places, and republished through one or more repository service. So how do humans and machine know whether they're accessing the authoritative copy? Has the authoritative source, not just the person, but also the data sender, been attributed or acknowledged in mirror sites? Where does the credit go? And this is particularly bad in some sites because they're actually not just copying the data, but they're also issuing a new DOI. And so then if you want to track usage of a data set using DOIs, it's very hard because it's got a different identifier, and particularly where the data is available as a service, you don't know that this is happening. One of the common problems is interpretation of the licensing, in that, well, I can copy this data, and some groups we've been doing a bit of follow-up work feel that they're perfectly within their right to do this because you have the data on an open license. Then needs to be replicated in order to preserve the quality standards of the original data. And I know from my own data center where we've gone to a lot of trouble to put full metadata, the files are copied, put into an online GIS, and none of the metadata is taken with it. Next. And so these are the ethics and expectation management issues that came. And Kira, and I see she's in the audience, I hope you don't mind, we pinched your slide, but she made the point that opening up data or any content to reuse means opening up to users we may not approve of. Do we avoid talking about the downsides when we promote open data and permissive data licensing? Another issue that's starting to bubble up. How aware is the researcher of the benefit trade-off inherent in when you put a permissive license on your data? Do you know what you're signing up to, or more importantly, what you're signing away? Next. So what constitutes ethical reuse and credit? And I'm glad to see Lisa's here because I had a conversation with Danny Kincaid of Big Demo the other day, and I think you're starting to hit some of these issues. Those involved in the curation, collection, and sharing of data should receive appropriate rewards. But what constitutes an appropriate reward? Because we haven't really thought this through. So for a researcher, the main interest is in citations when their data is reused. Does it matter to a researcher how someone accessed the data or from which repository, as long as it's recognized that this is their data set? If you take that attitude, then, and this is my problem, data repositories, publishers, funders need evidence and usage of traffic to their platforms. And it can be essential for nonprofits to demonstrate the value of what they have done to funders. And with this increasing amount of republication and duplication, I don't think that is happening. Next. So I just wanted to show you one use case. So, you know, it is genuine that this is happening. And this is the ASTER use case. It's a satellite data set which was collected by the Japanese. Now notice on the left, so the raw data came from funding from Japan and NASA. In Australia in 2009, they took these scenes that were available from this source and made it into a set of geoscience mineral maps that were available in 3 different formats on 10 different sites. Next. Yeah, don't get too jumpy when you see this, because in the yellow boxes, I was involved in the republication of this data in a format that was suitable for high performance computing. And I couldn't get a square answer as to who owned it, who we should be crediting, and when we did our derivative source. So what I did was develop this concept of the full path of data, that is the history of the data from when it was collected and the versions that were generated from it. So this was one of the use cases that was in our versioning group principles paper. And you can see how by starting to identify each box and what each person contributed to, that is whether they're a new derived scientific version of the data, or whether they're taking the existing data and putting it in a different format, or whether they're taking on the right the items, they're actually the locations where this data set is available. And I can tell you that when you actually then do this map and trace who is doing what, that very rarely are the grey boxes referred to as being the source. When you go to the derived data sets and all the hard work that went into producing this science product, particularly in online GISs, they're not credited. And what often happens in these online GISs is the data sets are appearing, but it is the portal that they're appearing that is licensed, not the data that is in the portal. And the source of it. So you can sort of see, I mean, this is the modern age. We're getting more and more complicated in how we acquire data, how we do derivative data. And so this is where we thought, by coming at it through understanding the version and the source, and with machine actionable provenance information within that data set, you could say, well, mine is derived from this. And when you go to the earlier one, you've got all those criteria back through there. Next. So I guess we're throwing 3 options through to you. Firstly, we clearly have to develop and promote the adoption of the data versioning principles that we have in our current paper. It's really good to have 5,300 reads, but what are people doing with it? Are they using it? The issue is that we have developed actionable recommendations from the principles. Do we tackle this building on what we did in the data versioning principles to develop best practice guidelines in attribution, authority, and ethics of data republication and sharing? If we do that route, we've got to actually start to get serious and develop use cases and go back to all the people that are on that wildfire comments list with all their use cases and start to say, well, look, this is happening. And so we do what we did before, where we compiled 39 use cases and then develop the principles. With this, we would develop guidelines on attribution, authority, and ethics of data republication and sharing. So they're the 3 that we, the leaders of the group, or from feedback we've had. But before we do that, I'd like to pause and throw it over to the audience and ask you, if we were to continue as an interest group, do you have a priority suggestion on what should be tackled by this group? So I'll now hand over both to Jens to take over. And don't forget, I've got the meeting notes there on the right. So if you don't want to speak up, or just start putting what your ideas or what we could do into the notes. I can't remember what page it's on, but it's at the end of the attendee table. Okay, yeah, it's back to you.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. I can't see the chat whether anybody's raised their hand. 2 people raised their hands, but I can't see who. I need some help here.
It's me here, Ari, but Maggie was first. So Maggie.
Okay, Maggie.
Yeah, with the risk of being stupid, I'll just make a couple of comments and then you can shoot me down if you want to. First of all, I just want to start to congratulate you on doing a really, really good job with this report. I think it reads very well and it brings up loads of issues which are very important to think about. And I think a lot of data practitioners or data management practitioners have not even started to think about this can of worms, so to speak, because it, as you suggest, as you point out, that there is a lot of iffy things going on here. Sometimes maybe on purpose, but mostly just because of ignorance, things get less than optimal in handling this. I would suggest, first of all, that I think it's not just the data itself that can change, or at least the description of it, or whatever. There can also be substantial changes to the metadata, i.e. the cataloging content that is really associated with a given data set when it is copied and placed in a different repository. And I know of cases where suddenly all the creator information was by mistake overwritten with something else, just because there was a problem with the API that was doing the data harvesting. So there needs to be some kind of better practices on checking these things. I mean, that the information is actually carried over. And I think one of the main issues here is that we are very bad at collecting provenance and making sure that each step that we follow in a data reprocessing or quality check or even just reformatting, we are simply not recording this information. And that could be because there is sometimes in various metadata models, there is no obvious place to put this information, or it is put in some kind of free text format that nobody can read, certainly not machines. And also with this metadata, especially when, even if you do put in the metadata that this is a copy of, or this is based on, and use these kinds of qualified references, I think there are really no centralized tools available that can read this metadata and sort of look back, try to follow chains of provenance or chains of well, how do you say, sort of the data trail back. The citation tools or the usage statistics tools, they just pick up on the latest version. They don't even look for these chains going back. And so I think that, I don't know if this group should also try to work on suggestions for those who make tools, who can work with the PID registries, with citation registries, etc., so that we can actually get started on some proper tooling that can do some of this or resolve some of these issues that you mentioned.
Yeah, those are very good questions. So thank you. I don't need to shoot you, as you were afraid I might. No, really, some of those points we did touch on in our discussions, but then stepped back and said we would want to concentrate in the working group on other items. So the question of what does it mean to change the metadata in our report, we said changing the metadata doesn't change the work; it only changes the catalog. But what we might note for our discussions in the interest group going forward, that we also include versioning principles on the catalog and metadata. That, so let's take note of that point. And the provenance question is also a very good one, where I would be interested to hear also about developments to tackle that. I've heard discussions in various approaches to knowledge graphs, the PID graph, and other works that try to address that. So thanks, those are very good topics.
I just wanted to mention that before I forget it, that I think a natural partner to continue this discussion and work would also be the interest group on data granularity.
Mm-hmm. Ari, you had your hand up.
Yeah. Just actually, Maggie mentioned many things which came to my mind as well. But just to actually look at this screen right now, what we have, where to next, I would at least think that we would really need to get these actionable recommendations done. I would really point to that one, because there's a lot of different kind of data infrastructure, from universities to research infrastructures to wherever, who would really need a kind of hands-on guideline, I would say, that what they choose for different versioning things, how would they affect their activities and so on, which would be perhaps a little bit more technical in sense than the document which was prepared earlier. And then I would say that this would be really useful for a lot of users. I don't know, do we have enough of manpower or person power here to do that? But it would be very useful, just from my perspective. Then about this issue of provenance, I think this is a very critical issue, but I'm not 100% sure is it this interest group who should be working on that, at least alone. I think it is so much, I mean, this whole provenance issue and how to include this kind of parent-child relations in the metadata and follow them through the usage. It's another question. And then another question again is the issue of, for example, which comes to mind very much of this example, which Leslie mentioned, is that nowadays, if you have an API to a database which has a lot of data in it, it's relatively trivial to make another service on top of it, which is actually even encouraged in some cases, that you build up your own whatever actual application on top of it. But then usually you lose the author information immediately. And then other people are using that one, and then the chain breaks and there's no way of following it. So I think it's also a cultural issue. How do you make sure that this kind of change of data is followed, either through metadata or even by some sort of citation system, if there would be a citation system for databases. But all of these are very interesting issues, but I'm not 100% sure how they fit to this interest group.
Yeah, and the other question is, which other interest groups could we speak to, so that discussions that we have on those issues that we decide not to follow but see as important, that we then push those topics over to other groups. Bob had his hand up first, and then Kirsten, please use the raise your hand feature, because then I can see that in the participants list.
Press the participants button in the bottom, and then you get another list, and there is a raise hand.
Great. So I'm raising my hand. Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Bob.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Jens. So I wanted to speak a little bit to that case study that Leslie presented to us, which was from the episode last year. And it might offer some insight as to where to go next, or just present an additional challenge altogether. But from a practical perspective, as a data repository, we're a domain data repository, the NASA Socioeconomic Data and Application Center, known as CDAC. What we've noticed is that a lot of data producers now come to us and they actually are trying to submit data to us that they've already put in a generalist repository. So this is kind of like the opposite problem. And we discover this, of course, right away. And we go back to them and we say, well, one of the things that we can't do is to publish the same data that you're publishing elsewhere, especially because you have a DOI on that. But we do offer a suggestion that if they are going to create a new version of the data set, which would be different from the current version, we would be willing to publish the new version of that. The other thing, though, that we've done based on a recommendation from our user working group is to approach the generalist repositories and ask them if they would be willing to take down the data and to have their DOI pointing from their tombstone page to our page where we could provide that data. And of course, as you might expect, the generalist repositories often are willing to take down a submission that they have already published and to put up a tombstone page. But interestingly, we haven't received any positive responses that they would be willing to point to us as the new data provider. And of course, there's no sense for them to take it down if they're not going to point to us. So it's a bit of a quandary there with that. But we are gaining some traction when we're talking to the data producers about ways in which they might improve their data by creating a new data version, and we're often willing to even work with them to identify areas where their data could be improved for our audience in particular. So that was my sharing of the insight from Leslie's use case. I'm not sure if it offers any directions for where to go next, but it certainly presents a real life problem, and I guess to some extent it might be related to Leslie's comment that in some cases data producers might not even care where their data are being published. However, what we found is it's more of a misunderstanding by data producers. They're being told by the article publishers, you need a DOI. And so what they're doing is they're just going to somebody who's going to issue them a DOI. They're not thinking about the use of the data. They're just trying to get a DOI. And then once they get their article out of the way, then they start to think about, maybe I'd like to have someone using my data. I'll go to a domain repository and see if they can publish it. Of course, at that point, it's too late. But this is all an interesting situation, and data versioning certainly does come into play here because it is an opportunity for the data producers to publish their data again in a new, improved version if they want to do that kind of work.
Yeah, that's also. Somebody's creating feedback here. If Leslie, do you want to comment? Otherwise, I'll hand over to Kirsten, who certainly has something to comment on Bob's question and suggestion.
Okay, I just like to put a couple of comments. Ari as well. Your comment about provenance group, the issue with that is the provenance group has folded in RDA, so we don't have that option. But when we thought through with the versioning that a best practice would be this data set is derived from, and you quote the DOI of the predecessor or predecessors. and then it's creating a chain. But yeah, it's conscientiously everyone doing that. And then I'd also go back to what Bob said, where the publishers are partly driving this, because people are just taking extracts of data sets, putting it on Zenodo, getting a DOI, and off they go. And so it's then something where we have to get to the publishers and the editors to actually, I mean, they check that the content of the data has not been, of the paper has not been published elsewhere. They should also look at that for the data sets. And that leads me on to the two drivers of why this is starting to get very bad is this need for people to have DOIs on their data sets. And the other one, which is the one Ari touched on, is that with services, it's just hopeless. And people can come and scrape a data set, create something of it, and then put it in their online GIS or website, and we lose all the provenance that is on the data set. So yeah, I think that's my two main comments. I'd agree with both what Ari and Bob said. Kirsten, would you like to?
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
No, that's fine.
I would actually like to go even beyond that, and taking the example of Bob in either direction, whether we start from a domain repository then go to another one. For me, a challenge is that well, if everything happens in my repository, if I have new data publications deriving from other publications, I can make sure to include these new references to the metadata. But as soon as the data are published in another repository, it's really hard to keep on this information that there is a new version of the data that has been already published by other people or by the same people, or that it's an improvement of another version. And I think it's really hard to. I wonder if we might find a technical solution similar to Scholix, like a way that we can find data and collect them and then bring them together with previous versions. There are so many versions around that I think it's really hard to manually keep track. That's the point, and especially when you change repositories.
Ari? And you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, and actually, I think Kirsten was before me here. So Kirsten,
I'm ready. I'm ready, Ari.
Oh, okay, yeah, but then put your. I saw your hand up still. Okay, so just one thing which came from this discussion about this different version. I think that the real problem with data publication is that there is no peer review and there is no editorial control. And as long as this is true, we can have anybody taking the data and publishing it in another place, or even the same person publishing it in several places, because there's no editorial control and there's also no kind of cultural repercussions for doing this. You can put your same data set in 1,000 places and that's fine. And if you try to do the same with journal articles, you will get very soon kind of complaints about this. So I think this is really the background cultural problem. We can definitely develop all kind of technical solutions for this, but as long as we can do this easily, it's going to be very difficult to solve just from the technical point of view. But we can try to do something.
Bob?
Yes, thank you again, Jens. To Ari's comment, I have to say that there actually is peer review of data at some domain repositories. And in fact, where I work at CDAC, we do conduct peer review. And even before we get to the peer review part, we have these initial reviews. And that's how we discover that the people already have a DOI for their data set, because we're just, we go when we read the article associated with the data, because we want to make sure that the data are valuable, just like the reviewers of articles want to make sure the article is valuable. We have to review the article in order to determine whether the data are valuable. So But that's the challenge, or one of the challenges, I think, for the data producers, because if they try to submit their data to a data repository that conducts peer review, then they have to do work. In other words, it's like when you submit your manuscript to a journal, they're going to come back at you and say, hey, this has got to be better for our audience. And we're the same way as a data repository. We ask the data producers to explain this, explain that, why'd you do this? Why'd you do that? Because we've got to document all this, and we actually ask them to help us document it. And so it's a lot of work. And one of the things that we hear is, why are they going to do all this work when they're not going to get credit for that work? So I'll just leave you with that.
Yeah, the credit question is a really sticky one. And I think we will need both. We need to develop our cultural, social practices around data, but technology can help. So work done like with the PID graph could help trace these trails of data, because it's, as a publisher of a data set, you could know that this data set is derived from a precursor, and that you can put into your metadata. As a publisher of the precursor, you might not know about the derived data set. I see that as a problem, and that problem has been around since before DOI for data. So when we came up with this idea of this element of a related item, we were fully aware that this will never be complete and probably only work in one direction, or the direction that you know of. And this is where the aggregation of catalogs and then transformation into graphs could be a technical solution, but it still leaves open the cultural and social dimensions of what does it mean and who gets the credit. Maggie?
I just wanted to make the comment that, of course, I also put in the chat that there are many options of adding or editing or updating the meta information that is associated with the PID record. But it's typically only the original requester of a PID or minter of a PID that has that administrative access. And I've heard from scientists, my colleagues who have been using some commercial service for storing data. They uploaded metadata, they gotten a PID, etc. And then the person who had the password that was associated with this request has died or left or has forgotten everything, and then nobody has the authority to update or change any of the registry information, including the resource locator, etc. So I think we also need to work with repositories, we need to work with data curator organizations, with data stewards, so that they also understand that it is necessary to maintain and administratively keep checking that the things are correct, and leave possibilities for updating information, including these things as has been replaced by or is the same as, etc. Because people are losing out. They are fully aware that there is a need to change something, but they simply do not have the capability of doing so anymore.
We have we have operators of data centers and data publishers in the audience, don't we? Well, I would be interested to hear from their experience. Kirsten?
Without repeating what I said, but I think you really touched the problem. It is okay for the newer version to, and if they're serious, like we are domain repository, we always make sure that the provenance of the data are provided. But if I see many data that are published with some general repositories without much curation, and this together with the very little experience of many researchers to know what to describe with their data, makes it very, very challenging to keep on this careful tracking of or including of papers and of all of data sets and versions in the metadata. And especially, I have never received any call from a data center where a subsequent version was published that this has happened. So in that point, I think having this I think I'm always thinking of colleagues, and they just create this pool of all data and of all papers and the relations between them. And this would be great to have also for these data, to see that I can go to a certain place to get information on previous versions of the data to make sure that my metadata are best possible, whatever.
Yeah, that a technical tool like that. So is there a group that we could work with to address the technical side?
I would say data side, but they should first make sure that this linking works between papers and data, which has for me higher priority. That I can ask them, and I think they're currently trying out this event data where I can see that my data was published. And the next step for me would be to provide an API where I can include the information automatically on my metadata, and not manually. But it's, anyway, I don't know.
So is data citation working? Is it actually happening?
Angie, I've said yes because I'm writing so many emails, so it's all manual work.
So we still have a little bit more time to discuss, but we could start thinking about what the focus and the key points of the data versioning interest group should be. And so of the topics we've discussed, how would we prioritize them, and did we miss anything? Yes.
I would continue. I would really like to continue the BOF we put in late for the last plenary. I couldn't attend because of the time of the day, but seeing what happened with this metadata being republished somehow in another repository, I think this is something, if we make people aware of, or like if we discuss these ethics behind a bit more and include it in our recommendations, this would be interesting for me at least.
So one approach to that could be collecting use cases again, which I think was a very workable approach.
Jens, I'd like to suggest that, provided we can resource it, and again, reflecting back on how we did the first report, it did take us over a year, maybe 18 months to collect and then synthesize those 39 use cases. so that if we wanted to, we could actually have that bubbling away in the background, because as I said, a lot of it's hearsay. And then certainly in my own case, you've got to be very careful, because like I could present on where bad cases are happening, and it actually turns out you're calling out some pretty major organizations and repositories for what they're doing. And so there's going to be a really sensitive issue that we will have to take on board. Because
Yes.
you're documenting what other people do to your data, and they may not like being called out. But at the same time, so that's saying we get started on 3 by compiling use cases, right? But I would argue we could, like, promoting the versioning principles through other work groups, that should be, say, a 6-month target, right? And then, as Ari suggested, we probably need help from him on how actually we develop those actionable recommendations would be the second goal to follow on. Anyway, that's just a suggestion.
So your suggestion is to, first priority would be to promote the adoption, and second priority would be the actionable recommendations. And so, yeah.
And then thirdly, start collecting the use cases, right? But bearing in mind that some of these use cases will involve third parties, we probably need to think a little bit carefully about it.
Yes, that's a very good point. That we have to think about. There are confidentiality issues here, which is also very interesting, because we start maybe getting to a core of a problem when it starts to hurt.
What does everyone else feel about it?
Yes, Maggie.
Sorry, I forgot to lower my hand earlier.
Oh, okay.
Kira, do you have any ideas from your perspective with your work?
I was just thinking, hang on, let me get video. How does it start? Oh, anyway, just when we were talking about use cases, I mean, I know we're all concerned about sort of the potential negative implications of someone going and taking a whole bunch of data from elsewhere and putting it in their generalist repository. But possibly we could also look into positive cases. Like I think Fixture was claiming that, you know, it's good for them to replicate the stuff that was on Pangea, because, you know, it's better for long-term preservation to have it in multiple places, and it might get more exposure so that the researchers get credit. Are there, you know, positive cases where there are actually good impacts of republication of data that we should also look at, in the sake of, you know, having a balanced approach to it all? That's just something that came to my mind just now.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I remember that discussion, because it is a bit of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, yes, lots of copies keep stuff safe and it promotes their use, but then we have the credit question. So who gets the credit for supplying the data? Is it Figshare or the disciplinary repository?
Yeah.
Lisa?
So in my case in Woods Hole, we are, so I'm from the library, and we have a generalist repository, but we are the DOI minters for BecoDemo, which is a domain repository. So I think we're an interesting use case that at the beginning of BecoDemo, they felt they were an NSF funded project, and if they were not sustainable, that at least the library has a history of being there for 100+ years, that the data would be safe. So when I hear people talk about republication, ours is a different model, because I see us as partners with BecoDemo. We work on versioning with them. They create their metadata that is in our repositories. So I would put us forth as a different kind of use case for republication.
Put you forward also as a positive use case.
Yes, it's been a
So-
really great partnership to actually the whole idea of doing versioning. We use DSpace. It was our library that pushed the DSpace community to do versioning because we saw early on with data that that was going to be really important. So yes, I would put us forth as a positive use case, and in that, and again, that lots of copies keep stuff safe is certainly, and there's been problems with the national repository that BecoDemo has dealt with about licensing, and so we see the library sees the BecoDemo partnership as a way to continue to push the boundaries. And I think about how things have changed with DOIs from the beginning. I mean, even from the first DOI we minted, if you changed anything even a little bit, then the community was saying, oh, you need a new DOI. And now we're talking versioning, and we're talking about different things. And so it's really been an interesting research environment for me as a librarian to be part of, and also just part of our mission that we're here to serve our scientists in Woods Hole, and BecoDemo is a part of that. And through different leadership in BecoDemo, that's continued. And I see this, the whole changing landscape with data has been a really interesting research challenge for us all. So.
Kira?
Hang on, yeah, I got some kangaroos for you, Leslie. Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, so yeah, so if we can find positive use cases like that where there is a genuine benefit to everyone involved, then that I think could serve as a really useful framework for how to approach republication of data in ways that are genuinely good and where people do feel like they're all getting the credit they deserve. And maybe those could serve as a framework of examples, just as a thought.
So the collection of use cases then should be part of the interest group. So I think we have quite a lot of topics now for an interest group. But is there still something that we are missing, or have we covered the important topics that we should be dealing with? Yes.
I'm quicker switching on my camera and raising my hand and putting this little blue hand on the. I think can't we keep some flexibility, because we now have a bunch of topics to deal with, and why not adding new topics when they arise and when they are getting important? Not so it's.
Yes, the question is now. Well, why am I asking the question now? It's because we have to develop a charter to transition to an interest group, and so the plan is that we submit this charter fairly soon, but realistically within the next 2 or 3 months, so that we have it through tab before the next plenary, which is in 6 months' time.
Does it need any actual activities done there? I mean, listed that these are the kind of things what we want to tackle soon, or should we just include that? I mean, data versioning, definitely, we can of course have some examples there, but I don't think we necessarily need prior. I don't know. Do we have a tab liaison here somewhere explaining us? But I'm not sure.
Yeah, of course we can ask our tab liaison for advice on this. But
do we have one in the room?
I don't see any. Ming?
And I just speaking of the experience from data discovery paradigm interest group. So when before it start, it gathered the interest from participants, and they got 10 topics from participants, and then in the charter said this is kind of interest from participant, but we go with top 2 or top 1 to work with, then gradually move on to topic by topic. When one topic finish, roll out to next topic, because you can't do all at the same time. So we had so that's why we had several task force. Each task force attacked one specific topic. Then when that task force finishes, then we ask participants what other topics you want to working on. Then yeah, it's learning and topic over topics. So.
There's
So
several raised hands, but I'm not sure whether they're still current. Lisa, is your hand up? No. Kira? No. Bob?
Yes, thanks, Jens. So in terms of the charter, I would say that it would be important to try to define the scope in such a way that it can accommodate the topics that have been raised, as well as some potential new topics that might be raised that are relevant to the general topic. So this way, by having a broad scope focus, though, on, say, versioning, then it will make room for these new topics that do evolve as people delve into the particulars of these issues that are being discussed.
So the question is, how will we go about developing the charter? The easiest way would be the interest group chairs draft the charter and then send it out. But is there another way? We could also arrange a meeting to spend an hour working on developing the charter. How should we go about this?
I think number one, Jens, is we've got to work out who the chairs are.
Mm-hmm.
And so ask people in this group, does anyone want to step up and be a chair? Because at the moment, or in the last 6 to 12 months, Ari and Bob were chairs for the last 6 months. It's been driven from Australia. So I guess there are 14 people here. Does anyone want to be a chair or know of anyone who may want to be a chair? Don't all speak at once.
I would like, but I would like to know how much work it is and if it's manageable beside. I think much easier for an interest group than for a working group because of the time constraint. But
I think that's the advantage. If we push it back to being an interest group, it's going to be, as and when people have time, which makes it easier. The working group I found too stressful because we kept on getting these notices from TAB, what are you doing? When are you going to do this? And
nice.
You got to present this. So I just don't want to go through that again.
Well, I could volunteer being part of a group, but only if the others don't want. So if you like, if you think it makes sense.
Anyone else, please?
certainly thank you very much for offering, Kirsten. We might still put out a call through the mailing list, because there are quite a number of people on the mailing list and not so many are here because of the time zones that might just be not suitable. So then our action plan will be to send out that call and then start working on the charter, and then things will, I think, unfold from there. Leslie, Ming, what do you think?
Yeah, that sounds a good plan.
Sounds like a plan, but
Yes.
But if you don't ping chairs, who is driving the charter?
I think that the developing the actionable recommendations will be quite a piece of work, and this is something that yeah, Leslie.
I was just going to say, yeah, that's the part that scares me. Ari, you spoke on it earlier. How do you think we should approach that? Because I'm not sure.
Well, I think we would have to have a separate meeting on this, but this is also something which I would need for my own project as well. So that's why there's actually resources in my head also for this.
That's what I was going to ask you, whether or not you had resources. I'm just holding back because I may be able to get resources to help with the compilation of the use cases. So that would be item 3. But so if you did that, would somebody from your group like to come on as a chair? Because I see that as a, something that's 1/3 of the group.
Yeah, we can definitely. You know how rubbish I am as chair, so I'm not suggesting I just quit in that one. So I have to find somebody better then. Maggie, are you interested to be in chair?
No, I just wanted to say that one can, of course, organize the actual work in the form of task forces or something like that. So as to not to burden the chairs as such with a lot of work, because I think chairing takes its own efforts and the time and resources. So the more you can engage a couple of people to be responsible, non-chair people for being responsible for specific tasks, I think that lends itself to sustainability rather than burning everybody out in 2 weeks.
I think you've nailed it, because see, the importance of what Ari just said is that he's got a project that's going to do it anyway. And so this broadens out the context.
Or how could I say that I can somehow try to squeeze at least some of this work related to it, because it is a kind of policy issue, and I can see that this can be put into this work.
Yeah, and I can also say that, of course, within this Fair project where you are also working, Ari, we have this task force on that is touching on credit and citation and things like that. So we can certainly do some work there, but and I could also be interested in participating in the work, but not to lead anything.
So I can take that one as at least in the beginning as my task to figure out from Fair side on that one. But of course, as our RDA activity, then we have to do it openly and see who else would like to commit on that one from anywhere else, at least in the non-commenting and stuff like that. That's how it works.
So how about, yes, that interest group chairs will take more responsibility for promotion and coordination than have 2 task force. One is for, one task force is developing an actionable recommendation. Another task force is more about collecting use cases about republication and mirroring and as such.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. It's a good division of the work.
So someone can lead the task force activity, but not need to take responsibility of as a co-chair of the interest group.
Mm. Yeah, that sounds like that's great. So then we would need people to run the task groups, though.
So I cannot, of course, you know how rubbish I am in this kind of stuff, but I'll try to do my best with the task force on this part, kind of making them really actionable things. But we need to discuss this also then offline as well, because
yeah, we can arrange a meeting to discuss this.
Yeah.
Okay.
The few people on the call who haven't said anything yet. Do you want to say something that we might have missed or contribute something? It's okay if you don't just want to listen. Is there anything that we should discuss in the remaining minutes? Or do we want to have a break before the closing plenary? So it sounds to me like we want to have a break before the closing plenary. Let's do that. So let me thank everybody who for today for this discussion. This was great, really constructive. I think we have a plan going forward. And then thank you everybody who contributed to the group leading up to this point, to the use cases and the report. And then we also would like to thank the RDA Secretariat and our TIB liaisons, Stephanie Kittas and Tobias Weigel, because they were really good in guiding us through the process. And the thank you to Australian Research Data Commons for their support. As Leslie said, we wouldn't have gotten here without their very active support. Leslie, Ming, anything to add?
No. What can I say? It looks like people want us to keep going, which was the purpose of this meeting, right? So I guess with that on board, we will keep going and
Okay.
see where we end up. I'm quite happy. Okay.
Then thank you very much for coming. It was great to see you at least on the screen. Hopefully see you in the not too distant future at some other event in person. And of course, I always love seeing you on screen. That's great too. Thank you very much, and see you virtually at the closing plenary in a few minutes.
See you.
And I'll
Okay.
stop the recording now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I hope
Hey,
it's
Ari,
not. Yeah. Hi.
what do you want to say?